Good evening, this is Mae Brussell. The title of this broadcast is World Watchers. It's program number 753, and it's May the 12th, 1986. A listener to this program from Santa Cruz sent me a letter to the editor written to a small publication called Leviathan, and it's written by John Loftus, who wrote The Belarus Secret, and it's a letter asking for help, and it sort of describes about what's going on in this country. I'm going to share it with you, and you can send for the address. I'll give it on the air one time and its phone number. Maybe you can follow through on this, and if I go too fast, send a self-addressed stamped envelope to me, Mae Brussell, P.O. Box 22511 93922, and I'll have more information for you. John Loftus wrote to just the Leviathan, Dear friends, I need your help. I'm a former war crimes prosecutor for the Justice Department, the only one in the last 40 years permitted to research the Nazi connections to top government archives. For 6 years, my wife and I have tried to expose how the United States intelligence agencies protected Nazi war criminals, and they also brought them here and hired them then. I broke this story in 1982 with 60 Minutes, with an Emmy Award. My history of Nazi smuggling programs, The Belarus Secret, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. In the last 3 years, I have given lectures, testified before the House Judiciary Committee, and had created a special congressional commission to investigate Nazi war criminals. He said, for the past 2 years, my wife has been crippled. She was attacked by a psychiatric patient. And this is where the retribution comes down on these people. She was attacked by a patient. She's crippled for the rest of her life. We had to mortgage our home to keep the research going. The financial pressures are unbearable. Congressional groups are requesting more and more assistance, which takes me away from my law practice. I've never requested donations before, but now I need help. Please send to the Loftus Fund, 372 Spring Street, Rockland, Maryland, 02370. You can call him 617, area code 617-871-0168 or 871-6312. Now, Mr. Blair, who wrote a book on the oil conspiracies, he was dead just about the week that his book came out. And Mr. Borkin, who wrote The Crime and Punishment of I.G. Farben, was dead the book that the time and date that his book came out. And a gentleman who wrote on the exposures of Reverend Moon and testified for congressional committees and headed those committees, he was dead when that book came out. There's a pattern of killing these authors and getting rid of them so that they don't do tours and promote their books. But John Loftus has been very visible, and one of the worst things you can do, I mean, it's pretty bad to kill the author and the researcher, but when you maim somebody and make her crippled for life, it is horrendous. So I'm passing this on to you, and thank you, the listener who sent that to me. Last week I talked about the Chernobyl reactor and was there sabotage, and I believe, by the way the news read, the reactions, and the way this thing happened, I believe that it was purposely sabotaged for one of many, almost 50 or 60 good reasons, and I continue to believe that, and I'll update that for you later. This past week there was an article titled Soviets Blame Human Error. They admit the damage was widespread, and then there was a press conference and an editorial article written by Mr. Andronik Petrosant from the Soviet Union titled Highly Improbable Factors Cause Chemical Explosion. And he said, so far I cannot name the exact cause of the accident. The processing will take a long time. I can say with absolute certainty there is no nuclear explosion. It is more probable a chemical explosion took place. I know this is a serious accident. We have had nothing like it since we began the nuclear industry. The accident was caused by a combination of highly improbable technical factors, and I cannot speak with certainty, but we are inclined to believe that personnel made mistakes that complicated the situation. The principles of individual operations must have been misused. That was an understatement of the year, and I understand they have moved out certain people involved with this who could have taken earlier actions, but by not taking those, they became the subject of scorn throughout the world, and just at the time that the president was, and I say the president because he runs the summit meetings or gets so much attention here, was in Japan ready with the summit, and he could talk about the Soviet Union. One of the matters that is very, very important that I've talked about on World Watchers, not enough, and should do more, I'm going to bring it up again, is the relocation of the Navajos. You can write to your congressman. Here's some more homework besides reaching John Loftus. If you haven't called, or if you can, write to members of Congress, the Senate and Congress, on the consequences of Public Law 93-531. July the 8th is the date that the Indians, the Navajo Indians, are to be relocated, particularly into Flagstaff. They don't speak English. There's a lot of alcoholism and liquor problems, drugs with the American Indians as soon as they leave the reservations. The Committee on Interior, the House Committee on Interior and Insular Affairs, reported just 2 months ago, March 25th, 1985, that the Indian Relocation Commission program is not working. They referred to the Appropriations Committee. The Relocation Act would cost taxpayers $1.5 billion, but that's the least of it. Just the resettlement is $1.5 billion. But they don't have jobs, and many people, they're dying of broken hearts. And this was something that was set up in 1974 by the Nixon administration and then Gerald Ford. And under the land where the American Indians live in this area is uranium. Uranium will be used for Star Wars, for atomic bombs, and the karma of removing these people will have to come back to us now. We can worry about hands across America. Feeding people isn't the problem. The summit had a problem with a surplus of food. There's too much food. It's in the state of mind of the very people running this country, and you have to deal with that. There are a lot of people on the peninsula and elsewhere, right where I live, the so-called, I call them the professional liberals, who cry when these things come down and really quickly want to do something in El Salvador or do something for the American Indians, and they get together and have their socials and their boo-hoos. But the important thing, and they don't believe that, is the way that Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford got power, even through the murder of John Kennedy. If they investigated it properly, they would remove these people from making decisions of relocating the Indians. Jack Anderson had an article last week, and also there was an editorial in one of the newspapers on another threat for American Indians. Jack Anderson said that there are 12 possible sites for nuclear waste from the atomic energy facilities and from the weapons factories, and 5 of the 12 are on American Indian reservations that will be possible dumping grounds. And in one article I have last week, April 28th, is titled, Another Threat for Indians. And it says, since the Europeans set foot in the New World, American Indians have been squeezed into smaller plots of barren land. Now the federal government has proposed that crystalline rock underlying 5 of their reservations could be used as subterranean dumps for highly radioactive nuclear waste. Lawyers want to block the proposal. They are outraged. The government is looking for 2 places to entomb thousands of tons of spent reactor fuel from the country's nuclear power plants. The waste is dangerously radioactive. It will last for thousands of years. The U.S. Department of Energy has selected a dozen potential sites in 8 states, and 5 of them are on Indian reservations. The Indians on reservations are profoundly impoverished. They're discriminated against. They're short-lived. And for them, the meaning of life is still drawn from their land, their tribal home, and their kin, and they hold this in common. The Indian reservation encompasses some of the least hospitable ground in this country, granted, but this is where generations of Indians have been able to live with sacred ground, and their ancestral bones are buried there, and now all of a sudden they're going to put 5 of the 12 locations for dumping nuclear waste would be on reservations of the American Indians. There is a movie called The Broken Rainbow that won an Academy Award this past year. If you get a chance and live in a large enough city, we don't have it here in Carmel, and I haven't seen it on any movie billboards when I'm down in L.A., try and see the movie. It's about the relocation of the Indians, and 25% of these people have already died. Countless others have been evicted by unscrupulous ways. The dispersal of 15,000 Navajos is being justified as a dispute between the Hopis and the Navajos, and this movie tells you about it. A terrible article in the Washington Post, April 26, titled "Distortion of Despair," putting down the fact of the plight of the Navajo Indians and their relocation. LA Times, May 1st, 1986, had a story, "American Indians found 3 times more likely to die young." Well, they are given tremendous problems, little health care, and now there can be a complete genocide where they're pushed out totally, and that isn't surprising. Jack Anderson also had an article May 1st, "Malaria Scourges World Bank Project," and this is about the Indians in Brazil. And he said the environmental experts have predicted disaster if the World Bank encouraged Brazil's ambitious landowners in the Amazon rainforest to continue with what they're doing. The state of Rondônia is in the heart of a World Bank project. The controversial jungle clearing scheme has been possible because so far $500 million in loans have come from the World Bank. 1/5 of that money comes from the United States. They moved a large number of Indians into the area, 500,000, and told them the land was cheap and they'd have a bright future. This has been going on for 4 years. They found out the soil was bad, there's violence in the area, and furthermore, 200,000 now have malaria, and it's a very dangerous, virulent strain. And Jack Anderson was saying that Senator Robert Caston, Jr., Wisconsin, was asking that the World Bank stop sending more money because it can really be translated into a genocide for the Indians. Now, this same representative from Wisconsin, Mr. Caston, Senator Caston, was concerned about Brazilian Indians. I have an article about Wisconsin Indians that were forced with eviction by Exxon. This goes back to 1981. Is the plight of Indians being in an area in Wisconsin close to Mole Lake. They were kicked off all their other lakes and reservations, and that's where they grow wild rice and support themselves. And Exxon came in May 1976. This was 2 years after the decision to move the Navajos out of Big Mountain into Flagstaff and get them off of their holy sacred territory. This again goes through the Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford, Nelson Rockefeller era. In 1976, they were drilling 70 holes in the ground. Less than a mile from the Mole Lake Reservation, they discovered the richest mineral deposits in the world. 75 million tons of sulfur, iron, pyrite, which is valuable for zinc and copper, traces of silver and gold, and then Exxon started to drill, which would cause Mole Lake to be devastated. And the excuse was that the Exxon needed these minerals, and again, they can use them for military purposes and for profit and money and push these poor Indians. And one of the other things in this study was uranium is found in metal deposits. And once again, Exxon, with Nelson Rockefeller, became vice president after Watergate. Crook, Nixon appointed Gerald Ford, and Ford had Rockefeller, the head of Exxon, as vice president, and they took an area of 12 square miles close to lakes where the rice growing supported the tribes up in Wisconsin, and just literally took over. They need that Mole Lake for survival, and Exxon came in and pushed them away so that it's easy for a member of the Senate to worry about the World Bank and malaria and genocide of Brazilian Indians, but I'd have to go back and look up what Senator Caston did at the time in Wisconsin. You can, as I say, send a message to your congressman, one of these overnight letters, or just, I think it's better than telephoning the office. Stop PL, that's the bill, 93-531, as soon as you can. If you haven't sent a letter, please do that and let them know how you feel about it if you're sufficiently angry. The Washington Post had a story April 20th, wanted an elite corps of assassins, and their quotations from the book The Last Hero about Wild Bill Donovan, the head of the OSS. This was Anthony Cave Brown's book. I've quoted that book quite a bit and cited a lot of things, particularly the British American Canadian Corporation, which was Permindex, foreign Permindex, with the assassination teams to kill those people that were in the way of corporations, of rearming Germany, and getting ready literally for World War III, pulling all the various countries together and killing heads of states, and in this country the most notorious Robert Kennedy, John Kennedy, Martin Luther King. Finally, the Washington Post had a quotation from the book, wanted the elite corps of assassins, U.S. agents' modest proposal for saving the world from collapse. And you don't see this printed in the national media very much, but they talk about a particular person who worked in the OSS, an agent named Carlton Kuhn, who's described in this book, and he told Mr. Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan of the OSS, that we need a group of people that will do murders. He said that there's a clear and objective mind that could prevail in this new technological society. We need some other power, some third class of individuals, aside from the leaders and scholars, specifically the assassins. And this third class has to have the task of thwarting mistakes, of diagnosing areas of potential world disequilibrium, and nipping the cause of potential disturbances in the bud. There must be a body of men whose task it is to throw out the rotten apples as soon as the first spots of decay appear. Now, this was happening in 1945, 46, 47, and the CIA was formed by 1947. And Mr. Carlton Kuhn was telling Mr. Donovan, from the OSS and then the CIA, that you need this group of people, a third class. Your first class are your leaders, your second class are your scholars, and your third class are your assassins. And those are the three groups of people that you need to keep the Western world escalating at the pace it's going right now. He said a body of this nature must exist undercover. It must either be a power unto itself or been given the broadest discretionary powers by the highest human authorities. The only organizations in existence today which have even the rudiments of what it is needed in this formation are the body of men from the OSS and SOE, that's the British Special Operations Group. And that is the group set up by William Stevenson that became the network of the assassins, known and described in the Torbett document as the Permandex Operation. The SOE was the British counterpart in the OSS. And in this book, it refers to, again, the book on Raymond Donovan, Wild Bill Donovan, not Raymond Donovan, the Secretary of Labor, but he was part of the Permandex Operation and the Jimmy Hoffa wipeout and the control. That's another subject. But the two Donovans weren't far removed from the entire Permandex operation. But this quotation from the book says the agents of these two organizations, from British intelligence and American, are trained to act undercover, to act ruthlessly without fear. We include objective scientists in our midst and men with the widest experience of political, economic, and diplomatic fields. And the scientists are the important ones because of the Hughes Medical Institute, of DuPont, of Roman Haas, of IG Farben. We will use objective scientists. And then this article continues the quotation. It seems, therefore, to me, not too wild, too visionary, or too improbable a thought to suppose that from these groups a smaller group will be selected, a group of men sober-minded, without personal ambition, men competent to judge the needs of our world society and take whatever steps are necessary to prevent this society from a permanent collapse. Now, that was part of the book on Wild Bill Donovan, The Last Hero, and last week and many weeks before, I've cited their intention to go into bacteriological warfare, chemical warfare, and there are different ways of breaking up facilities and institutions, and this elite corps of assassins was indeed formed. There was an article in February I didn't have time to put on the air. I have many, many thousands of back articles. This is from the Houston Post. CIA report contends the rebels are not equipped to slit enemy throats. Contras lack knives? ? Well, all you have to do is to open the Soldier of Fortune magazines and see about the mercenaries that go all over the world, or Gung Ho, or any of these military magazines, and they are wall-to-wall issues of knives and how to cut throats and so forth. The defense of the CIA or the Contras not cutting throats of the various people in Central America was they tried to throw it out by saying that they didn't have enough knives to cut throats which is absolutely ridiculous because cutting throats is a favorite method of killing prisoners. This was in the same article from Houston Post that somebody said, and they have affidavits from Nicaraguan Americans who witnessed people having throats cut and human rights abused. And that, again, goes along not only with killing heads of states, but individuals. Now, there's just a few articles. I'm going to run down just the titles of them so quickly because I want to get on to other material, but I can't help pass them up. One was the New York Times, May the 1st. President asserts his military role. Ronald Reagan has sent a message to Congress warning against infringing against the votes that the Joint Chief of Staff of the Pentagon wants. Another item is Ronald Reagan having a formal portrait with Emperor Hirohito. Our First Lady is sitting on a chair, all smiles with her hands crossed, in her long flowing white gown, and there's the President of the United States, about 6 feet tall, with Mr. Hirohito. He looks like he's 4 feet tall, just up to his shoulder. This is a formal portrait with the Reagans posed with Hirohito at the Imperial Palace banquet, and next to it on the same page is an item that Reagan refused to visit Hiroshima when he was in Japan, that he didn't want to go see that, but he would, in fact, have dinner at the Royal Palace with Hirohito. He didn't want anything to do with giving any recognition to the atomic bomb or worrying about nuclear disarmament. That's not on his mind. Quickly, the new ambassador to Brazil has been named. President Reagan intends to send Harry Schlaudeman. This is his personal envoy in Central America, will be ambassador to Brazil. We'll remember the murder of the president of Brazil last year and the change of the guard due to political assassination, such as the Permandex operation. Mr. Schlaudeman is a person I did broadcast about, not in the last year, but the year before, maybe with his role in Central America. He was very important in the murder of Salvador Allende. He is part of Kissinger's team, Henry Kissinger and Fritz Kramer. He's probably one of the most dangerous men around planet Earth besides Vernon Walters and William Casey. He's now been sent to Brazil. He will be sent to Brazil as ambassador. We no sooner get rid of somebody like John Gavin in Mexico as ambassador, who was a total disaster, than Reagan counteracts by making a one appointment that is 10 times worse, and sending Schlaudeman to Brazil is horrendous. A brief article in the paper this last week, Mr. Waldheim, Kurt Waldheim, praised Hitler in reports that he wrote in a doctoral thesis in 1944. He praised Adolf Hitler. Another article, New York Times, May 2nd, Israel urges public access to UN war files. Did it ever dawn on anybody why Israel didn't want to see who those war criminals were? As I say, the UN has a list of 40,000, and Mr. Waldheim is just one of them, and they waited till 1986, 40 years, to ask about those files. Another story, Edward Teller urges more funds for Star War programs. Edward Teller, the physicist who helped President Reagan sell Star Wars, told Congress that they should increase their spending, not cut, and don't give it to any missile defense. We need it for Star Wars. He helped Ronald Reagan March 23, 1983, initiate Star Wars. He had worked with him since 1966 when Reagan was governor of California. Another article, no evidence Contras are involved in drug trafficking, which is another outright lie. All they have to do is open up the secret papers, the court records in San Francisco that are locked up. Of course, there's no evidence when material is locked up, but if they would open the material that's locked up, they would find the evidence of the drug trafficking. The Washington Post has a story, April 27th, 1986. It's 2 full pages, 2.5 pages. Reagan's People Issues of Propriety. The Deaver case revives questions about senior officials in conduct. It's written by Howard Kurtz of the Washington Post, April 27th, 1986. It lists about 60 people that are into all kinds of trouble and mismanagement, and they are horrendous scandals. And they don't even include, this article doesn't include matters such as William Casey, the CIA director, being the attorney for Mr. and Mrs. Marcos and setting up dummy fronts in Panama to get tax skimming benefits and not paying the state of New York, or their role with Jay Dominelli in the San Diego scam. This barely scratches the surface, and when Reagan's out of office, there will be years of books and stories about these scandals. I maybe share some of this with you, but many of you do go to the library and follow up some of these articles, and you can look that up. It's a long, long story that deserves 52 weeks of airtime, an hour a week on each person, and I try to hit some of the major people time to time. Now, just to update the the Challenger investigation, which has been going on for a long time. A few key articles this week. April 30th, San Francisco Examiner, probe finds Challenger sure to fail. Now, if you haven't heard my 7 or 8 broadcasts on the Space Shuttle program and the Challenger, you can't appreciate their conclusions here, but the committee's ready to turn in their report, and this article says an O-ring seal on the Space Shuttle Challenger was almost certain to fail because of faulty design and near-freezing weather the morning of the launch. New and unpublished test results conducted about the panel summarize the situation. The booster rocket joint began to fail at temperature as high as 50 degrees. NASA officials said they were confident the crew would suffer no undue risk during the launch for lower than 50. The launch January 28th was 36 degrees. They estimate the temperature of the joint that operated the O-ring seal was 28 degrees. The test indicated the failure of the O-ring was more likely than not at that temperature. It took a lot of nerve for me 2 weeks after the Challenger disaster, when people were into such deep mourning and so many explanations were given, for me to say and give an entire hour on why I think it was allowed to purposely blow up and what would happen as a consequence of the blow-ups. And now they're ready to wind up their report, and they're talking about the cold and the effect on the O-rings. And one quotation said, the investigators believe 2 segments of the Challenger's right-hand booster were poorly matched, greatly increasing the probability of disaster. Another May 1st story in the LA Times, wreckage confirms joint failure, top investigator says. And again, it goes into the failure of the O-ring to seal on the shuttle, most certainly due to faulty design and to the near-freezing weather the morning of the launch, and they go into the very cold weather. This article was May the 1st, 1986. Another one from the New York Times, new tests prove cold-made shuttle seal failure inevitable. That's what we had on World Watchers, and I'm not even a scientific expert on how to build a space shuttle that is safe, but all of this was so obvious. Another article, which I don't think many of you have seen, it comes from a listener in Texas. She sends me wonderful articles from the Houston Post. This is April 19th. Diploma fraud worries Claude Pepper. 3 phony degrees at NASA. Claude Pepper from Florida was concerned Friday over FBI allegations that 3 men with phony engineering degrees from a diploma mill work in sensitive positions at 2 USA space centers. It disturbs me that NASA people were involved. There were a list of 72 federal employees and government contractors. 3 worked at Houston and Cape Canaveral space centers. And this, again, is like the explosion in the Soviet Union, where people could allow and sabotage that to happen. And again, briefly, this was allowed to happen. They could test the O-rings in the cold weather, and also they want to eliminate all the frills and make space for the military, because now that we've lost the shuttle, the priority is the military. And you couldn't do that unless you had a visual examination of what happened in losing one shuttle and the necessity of tightening up and turning it to the military. There was an article in the Houston Post sent to me by a friend who sends me these wonderful items on space, particularly in that area that we don't get in other papers. And this was Houston Post, April 19th. Diploma fraud worries Claude Pepper. And he's referring to 3 phony degrees at NASA, or 3 that he knew about given to him by the FBI. And these are 3 men that have something to do with the launching, bringing back the boosters, who have fake degrees. Among 72 names published last Friday, there were those alleged to be an operations engineer and section chief for the post-launch operations with the United States Booster Company at Cape Canaveral, who had no degree in engineering. And Claude Pepper said that there's a bogus Bachelor of Science degree in electrical engineering of a particular person in the aerospace with an important role, and another scientist who did not go to engineering school, who has a phony degree, who was part of the group to bring in the shuttle's reusable boosters after they were recovered from the flight. And Claude Pepper was worried about these phony PhDs. Another fellow working at Johnson Space Center in Houston in aerospace electrical engineering. They evidently wrote their own degrees and had them printed or published. There are mills to give you degrees in these things, and then they're in key positions. That can be very important in matters such as the blowing up of the, not with a phony degree, but sabotage in Russia with their atomic reactors, and also with the shuttle program where you have people in key positions who obviously are placed there for some reason and don't have degrees and aren't selected very carefully. That's why I think they're there for a purpose. We'll take a 1-minute break and then continue with some more of these news stories. There are so many of them, and I think you all would agree on that. This is Mae Brussell, and it's the second half of the program World Watchers. And I'm just briefly doing a few articles on this Challenger, the shuttle that went down at Cape Canaveral, because I've done about 7-hour broadcasts just almost totally on the Challenger. And I want to update a few items. One, just this past week from the LA Herald, grounding of shuttle program will save $1.5 billion. The prolonged grounding of the shuttle because of the Challenger accident will save NASA enough money for a sizable down payment on a replacement. They figure if we don't fly for a while, we'll save $1.5 billion. And then the senior interagency group said that to get a new orbiter and a new Challenger to replace it, and to pay for the recovery of the other parts, it might cost $8 billion over several years. But if they stay grounded for a little while, then it'll make up for the building. They're throwing around these billions that they save. So evidently flying it wasn't that valuable for the billions they would have spent to get the Challenger up, because they say, well, sitting on the ground, we're already saving $1.5 billion. They're not adding up the loss of what it was supposed to do or serve, but how much they save by not flying it, and we'll put it to a new one. The New York Times had an article, April 30th, virtual certainty of failure shown for shuttle seal. And I just cited that a minute ago, a shorter article, and it's a long explanation on how they knew it would fail, that there was a virtual certainty about that. And you can't help but wonder, if you've heard these broadcasts about the space program, how they even come out now and they're so flagrant in saying they knew it would explode. There was a certainty that it wouldn't hold up together in this cold weather. Another article about the critics of the Morton Thiokol company that didn't want the shuttle to go up in the cold weather. San Francisco Examiner, launch critic punished, the shuttle panel was told. And they got a reassignment of Alan McDonald, which is literally shocking because he said it was unsafe to fly this. So he has been pushed aside with a lesser job for squealing and embarrassing Morton Thiokol. The New York Times had a story this past week. Chairman of Shuttle Inquiry says NASA almost covered up the truth, and it's a story about how they were intent on covering up what's going on behind the NASA operations, and that Chairman William Rogers was able to get some of these truths out. I'm sure that isn't the whole story, because Mr. Fletcher, who was part of the Morton Thiokol operations from Utah, who was the head of NASA, has been brought back to be chairman of NASA again with an overwhelming approval. So a lot of the truths that would come out won't. And when you punish Mr. McDonald, you know that more truths will come out. He'll get the same punishment maybe as John Loftus, and maybe an accident or death in the family or to him. And we'll see 2 or 3 years from now that he'll be writing to please help him, that he's destitute and has lost his ability to hold on to his job, and there's been a tragedy in his family. The Monterey Herald had a story from the LA Times this morning that when the report comes out of the Rogers Commission, most members said that they believe that the much publicized teacher in space and journalist in space should be dropped, but there is no decision. The president is pushing that Mrs. Morgan to be a replacement for the teacher in space, and Walter Cronkite would be the publisher in space. But what they're hitting here is that the pressure of building up these situations, if you read between the lines, literally forced the launch, and the White House never released those telephone calls. So that's an assurance that the publicity, it is to me, that the publicity was a factor, because they're asking, don't put that kind of pressure on them anymore. Washington Post had an article May 3rd, 6 waivers let the shuttle keep flying, evidence that the NASA officials knew of problems and overrode the warning. And as I say, I believe from very early at the time of the accident, within 7 or 8 days, that it was meant to blow up. There are also stories about the terrorism in Europe. Mr. Gaddafi was punished on absolute proof that he was behind the bombings in Berlin and the nightclub, and now you see stories, New York Times and National Wire Service, one of them this past week. U.S. allies now believe Syria is behind the attacks. Whoops, sorry, Muammar Gaddafi, sorry, we bombed your house and the kids and so forth. Now Libya did it. In another article, disco attack suspects are rounded up in Bonn, Germany, and they have links to Syria. And now the next move will for us to go into Syria and into Lebanon again and get some of those Palestinians. And we've bombed, and we will isolate Gaddafi because we have to continue our policy in order to get that base in the Mediterranean. And as I say, Alexander Haig had set up that policy in 1981, but in the meantime, they're finding out a little bit more about the bombings, and Muammar Gaddafi didn't have as much to do with it as a lot of other people, even though they'll keep trying to justify by linking the two together. But this is the way we get what are supposed to be facts that we wouldn't share the United States government with other people. And then we went ahead and did the bombing and said to our allies, how come you don't go along with us? And then the allies work a little while and find other people than Libyans behind this, and they come from Syria and from the PLO. Now, the summit meeting took place this past week in Japan. I don't know how many of you read the articles, but one of the most horrendous things about it is the big problem with these people from the British American Commerce Corporation or the Permindex or whatever you want to call it is food surplus. You can have your African aid, your Hands Across America, etc. The problem is too much food, and I'll go more into that later. It is totally disgusting. And then at the same time, many of you might be reading these articles that are just pouring out. This is one from the San Francisco Examiner. Dairy slaughter may ruin cattlemen. And in a few weeks, I'll give you the statistics of how many cows are being killed, how we're going to remove the milk cows from production and give hormones and genetic engineering to a handful of cows to be responsible for all the milk, and condense the farm produce food corporations into 5 or 6 corporations, which I might have mentioned once before. But the summit was about too much food, and when you think of how many people are dying of starvation, you have to realize how obscene that really is. Now, last week I was talking about biological warfare, and Jeremy Rifkin, and an article he wrote for the LA Times and editorials about him. And I cited April 27th, the LA Times article, Part 4, Section 4, on genetic engineering, and he asked, can Uncle Sam be trusted? And the second part of that article, the full page of the editorial page, counteracting him, was an article by Will D. Carpenter, titled Unreasonable Rules Could Abort Potential Benefits. And Jeremy Rifkin had said that under the guise of making society go forward and reaping profits and benefits in direct proportion to how much you squeak, you get some really hard problems. So I want to go into the counterpart of Jeremy Rifkin, who is defending and lauding the fact that it's time to move away and get on with these sciences of genetic altering and putting live bacteria into our environment and so forth. Now, this article by Will D. Carpenter is titled, as I say, Unreasonable Rules Could Abort Potential Benefits. They're not sure, but they're potential. And he is the vice president of Monsanto Agricultural Company, which has a multi-billion-dollar operation equal in size and just as powerful as Roman Haas, the main corporation behind the European combine of DuPont in America, and from Sweden and Brussels and Canada behind Advanced Genetic Sciences. Now, what Mr. Carpenter says as vice president of Monsanto, that during the past 15 years, scientists have an unprecedented understanding of genetic constitutions. We have the ability to manipulate genes. There are incalculable benefits for mankind that this may provide. He's not sure. He says they may provide, or the potential benefit. Those words he throws in. He says molecular biology will be the science of the future. It will focus on human health care and over the next decade we will work on things such as AIDS, parasitic plague, malaria, and so forth. We will see 200,000 Indians with malaria in Brazil that could be stopped overnight if they wanted to. So what's the genetic engineering? There won't even be Indians down there by the time they get this thing rolling. And the Advanced Genetic Sciences Corporation did mention that the use of live genetic bacteria could affect the immune system. Now, Mr. Carpenter from Monsanto says there are many new agricultural techniques we can use. We're going to improve the efficiency of milk production, and that is in the news all the time, as I say, killing the American cows and throwing out and cutting down the milk, keeping the cost up. But he wants to improve the milk so you can throw more away, get rid of the cows. The contradictions here are so insane. To kill the cows we have and throw their milk out and improve the genes of a few cows, but he cites that. He says regulation and overview have been part of genetic engineering, and as a result there's fears about people not being able to voluntarily have safety guidelines, and that's what Jeremy Rifkin has been talking about. And he said the National Institute of Health has been careful and experiments have been watched, and there has been so far a degree of containment, but the experimental organisms used should be weak if they're weakened in some way and need to be tested outside the laboratory. It's time to do it. We're going to take these organisms out of the test tubes, out of the isolated places, and we have to see how they work in the environment. And he said there are two guidelines for safeguarding your environment and the public, and as long as genetic engineering experiments are confined to the laboratory, we won't know how to make these guidelines work. And now we have agricultural products on the horizon, and this field is the next step. The issue, he says, is now no longer containment, but the voluntary release of microbes carefully controlled in the field. Now, Mr. Rifkin has said you can't control it. It leaps over to the next plant or into human beings. It can't be controlled. And he concludes his article, his defense of this, or part of it, by saying the potential risks are very low. Now, one of the words he uses in this article in the LA Times, and this is Will Carpenter, Vice President of Monsanto Agriculture, perception is the key word in the public relation offices. He said the public must perceive that it and the environment are being protected, and you must have confidence that in the research and testing of biotechnology done by the scientists. Now, I just cited in the book The Last Hero how the decision was made to have certain scientists decide who lives and dies, that they would work with the scholars and the corporations, and that the scientists would be part of the killing team. Mr. Carpenter says, only when American people perceive they are protected will they reap the benefits of the new scientific breakthroughs. And as I say, the perception is important. And he says the new American breakthroughs are safe, and they should go on now with unnecessary delays pushed aside. Only when the American public perceives they are protected will you reap the benefits. Now, as I say, the key word here is the Americans. The corporate directors of Advanced Genetic Sciences, and I haven't even gone into Monsanto, include Mr. Henri Emanuelson from Sweden, Mr. Roderick Thompson from Bermuda, Mr. Bosmark from Sweden, Mr. Maliga from Hungary, Joseph Schell from Cologne, Germany, Mark Van Montague from Ghent, Belgium, the Biofrost Company from Canada, the Plants Genetic System from Belgium. Now, if the American public perceives they are being protected, then why aren't these people from AGS alone, which is described as a small company, which is part of Roman Haas, why aren't they placed somewhere else? Why do Americans have to perceive that we're safe? Why don't they go to Canada, Belgium, and Sweden, and Germany, and Bermuda? Well, Bermuda doesn't have the frost, but the others. So Monsanto says you have to trust us, and we have to have formal approval from the Environmental Protection Agency, which they got, and we will start planting this bacteria. And it turned out that the bacteria has been used since 1984 secretly, and that's another problem that broke in the news. He said we won't know for sure until the altered microbe is tested under field conditions. If it works well, it will be used to develop other biological pest controls to reduce conventional insecticides. and smaller entrepreneurial companies come along, and they will work on these projects. And then he says that we have to allow them to go out in the field now. Otherwise, Europe, Japan, and West Germany and the United Kingdom, who all have federally funded biotechnology, will beat us at the race. Now think of the axis of World War II and the plans for genocide and the meeting of Raymond Donovan and William Casey and John J. McCloy and the top corporate leaders when World War II was over that influenced our system. They're talking about Japan, West Germany, and the United Kingdom, the very group that were considering having a third element or party of world government, which includes scientists and assassinations. And so he says field testing is coming. Are you ready? Now, all you have to do is look up. I can give you references. I don't have time this week. Look up in your library on the testing of drugs and bacteria and mind-altering material. I mentioned last week that the human ecology movement was $25 million for the MK Ultra, and see whether you want to trust them or not. Richard Vagary, who is known for his mail order for the right wing, the extreme right wing, was speaking at the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco, and a listener to World Watchers sent me a tape of that luncheon broadcast, KEST 1450 on the dial. It was April the 16th, 1986. And Vagary is from Young Americans for Freedom. He started his political activity in the 50s. He's speaking at the same Commonwealth Club that I cited that William Colby was speaking at when he said there were 30 or 40 million too many Mexicans were the biggest world problem. The Commonwealth Club is where Douglas Sarawak was speaking. I mentioned last week talking about advanced genetic sciences and the huge billions of dollars that would go when we into the corporate funds when we released these living bacteria into our environment. So Richard Vagary is a guest at the Commonwealth Club, this same club, and among other things, I won't go into his whole lecture, but he was making fun of the people, the liberals, as against the serious far-right conservatives, and he said liberals even want to stop a frost ban activity or bacteria that prevents frost that could feed a hungry world. And he made some remarks about the liberals in Monterey County he was referring to, who got together and wanted to stop the first officially approved release of genetically altered bacteria into food crops in Monterey County. So in order to put down liberals, it was important enough for Richard Vagary of the far right to be talking about this at this particular time. And I might mention that a good part of the corporate directors of AGS come from DuPont and work as scientists, some of them from with the DuPont Corporation. And many of you know or don't know that Seagram Company, which is Mr. Edgar Bronfman of Permindex, who worked with Clay Shaw and the very Permindex that was set up to eliminate heads of states or anybody else in the way of these corporates after World War II. The Seagram Company and Edgar Bronfman are close partners and have a large corporate and stock commonality with DuPont, who is described, I think, best in Trading with the Enemy, Charles Hyam's book. But Permindex and DuPont and the very people involved with Mr. Donovan and British Intelligence and William Stevenson are a part of the biological chemical group from the DuPont area that go into the food we eat and into the farming. Now, several weeks ago, or just a week ago, there was a death at Monsanto, the same company that Mr. Bill Carpenter comes from. Francis Fitzgerald was new president of Monsanto Chemical for 1 month. And the obituary in the New York Times, April 28th, describes Francis Fitzgerald, the newly appointed president of Monsanto, died early Saturday morning of an apparent heart attack. Now, this is another one of these great apparent heart attacks. He was 58 years old. He was president of Monsanto for 1 month, and this is the company that has already tested and is ready to zoom ahead, along with Roman Haas, with the environment being tested with live bacteria, taking it out in the field. Mr. Fitzgerald lived as head of Monsanto for 30 days, like John Paul I, and I did broadcast on his quick expiration. He was the 30-day pope, and this looks like the 30-day president of Monsanto. And the obituary says that he assumed the presidency April the 1st, and by April 28th, he was dead. He capped a 35-year career with Monsanto, the world's largest chemical concern. They do an annual business of $7 billion. They're the American IG Farber, and I suppose And the chairman that would take over was a Richard J. Mahoney, the chairman of Monsanto, that they thought would take over, but he was bypassed, according to an article in the Wall Street Journal, May the 6th. The new president of Monsanto became Mr. Harbison. He's president and operating chief, and Wall Street Journal said Monsanto Corporation said it named Earl Harbison Jr., 57 years, as president and chief operating officer. Mr. Harbison, formerly vice president, succeeds Francis Fitzgerald, who died last month of a heart attack several weeks after having the post. Harbison's appointment was a surprise to some analysts who expected Richard Mahoney, their 52-year-old chairman, would assume the presidency. But Mr. Harbison, Harbison, a 19-year Monsanto veteran and former deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who most recently oversaw the melding of G.D. Searle and Company into Monsanto. One of the big mergers was the Searle Company into Monsanto. The company acquired the pharmaceutical concern last fall. So here is the deputy director of the Central Intelligence Agency, who's now chairman of Monsanto, and his agent under him, Will Carpenter, is writing an article on, he's not addressing the problems that Jeremy Rifkin is talking about. He says we're going to get out of the laboratory and put it in the field. He doesn't promise that it's safe, but he says if we don't do it, Japan and West Germany and Great Britain will do it. So let them do it in their countries, and the point is they're going to do it in this country, and Monsanto is going to head and do it. And the Wall Street Journal said, until yesterday's announcement, Mr. Harbison served as Searle's chairman and chairman of NutraSweet Company. I used to consume a lot of the low-calorie sweetening, the non-sugar products, sucralose and so forth, and NutraSweet when it came out, because I don't like the extra calories that are in sugar. But believe me, just a little clue to NutraSweet, I have a chart in my medical files on the fact that there's a part of the brain that connects the memory of relating and retaining information, and there's dangerous complications or questions about NutraSweet cutting off the connective memory. And when I'm with people, and I'm with a lot of people who want to remember something and they forget, and I say, you don't have Alzheimer's, but do you take NutraSweet or these substitutes for sugar? And I dropped it quickly when I read the possible danger to the brain. But now it turns out that the head of Searle, and who helped with the merger, is Mr. Harbison, deputy director for the Central Intelligence Agency. They use the word former there, but if you think of James McCord and Frank Sturgis and E. Howard Hunt and the Watergate team, you know that there is no former, and also a lot of the other formers that go along, once in the CIA, and so that this very important company has a role with a intelligence agency that was set up by William Donovan and British intelligence with the intended purpose to decide who lives and who dies, among other things, in order to keep the world in the shape that they want. Now, Daniel D. Adams is the chairman and chief executive of Advanced Genetic Sciences, with, again, their international connections to Bermuda, Germany, and the bank that carries their funding is the Morgan Guarantee and Trust Company. Well, Daniel Adams comes from the office of Sullivan Cromwell, which was the law office of Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles, when Allen Dulles had that $25 million into the human ecology movement for the CIA, which was the MK Ultra mind control program. So I just give you the cast of characters, with a former deputy director of the CIA being head of Searle Company with the NutraSweet and becoming president of Monsanto at a time when they're going full speed with releasing these bacteria, not pesticides, but living bacteria, into food and genetically altering animals to cut down and to influence food products under the guise of curing disease in swine and so forth. And the background of these chief executives goes right to the law offices or the people involved with World War II, with the funding of Hitler, with the intent to reduce the world population. And the story of food and agriculture is something that I would like to do every week if I didn't have to update the other articles. But they weave in and out and affect all of us in ways that are not separate news stories. Just as when I cite the malaria of the Indians, and these people are going to work on malaria, or the danger of affecting the immune system with advanced genetic sciences and the other corporations making this kind of material, and they say, well, we want to work on AIDS. The New York Times had a story April 25th, panel endorses field test of gene-altered pesticide. And this is a panel of 6 leading scientists who recommended that the Environmental Protection Agency allow Monsanto to conduct field tests on the first live gene-altered microbe pesticide in St. Charles, Missouri. Monsanto's pesticide, the third genetically engineered organism to reach the final stage of federal approval, is made of common bacteria. It is designed to kill soil-dwelling corn pests. The agency is not bound to follow a recommendation, although it has rarely opposed a decision made by the scientific advisory group. That means the EPA isn't likely to turn down a proposal by 6 scientists to say go ahead and do the testing now. And again, AGS was to be the first, and they lost the license to do that, but Monsanto is waiting in the wings. John Moore, the agency's Assistant Administration for Pesticides and Toxic Substances, would make a decision by May the 12th. And the article goes on, last month, after learning that a living gene-altered agent had been secretly tested outdoors in California, that's the AGS, they suspended their permit to field test, and they stopped them from testing what would be frost damage, that's AGS. Then it goes on, this month, the Department of Agriculture acknowledged that it had not allowed procedures to be followed that they had stated were necessary, and they suspended in Omaha a license to market living gene-altered viral vaccine. Now they've lifted that, and they can go ahead and give that to the hogs. Despite the favorable conclusions reached today by 6 scientists, the path to final approval for Monsanto bacterial agent is not free of obstacles. Last month, the scientists at the Environmental Agency reported that more than half the safety studies submitted by Monsanto were inconclusive, they were flawed, or scientifically deficient. The EPA scientists recommended Monsanto repeat 4 key studies, including 1 test, to prove that the microbial pesticide would not harm beneficial insects like honeybees. And if you check off the influence of honeybees, you lose the cross-pollination, and you can cut off a tremendous amount of crops and fruits by harming the honeybees. The Department of Agriculture has asked for studies to determine whether or not the bacterial pesticide poses a threat to important crop plants. This article continues about the proposals by Monsanto, the opposition by Jeremy Rifkin on the dangers, and how the advisory panel was going to allow a test permit the Environmental Protection Agency would. And the New York Times says, in its report, the panel took note of studies that were scientifically weak by Monsanto. Based on the quality of their studies, the agency could deny an experimental use and request more information, which they did. But I understand that they've gone ahead and allowed Monsanto to proceed. The New York Times story says some of Monsanto's work is deficient, said Dr. David Pimentel, professor of insect ecology at Cornell University. Monsanto has spent $2 million over the last 2 years, according to officials studying the gene-altered pesticide made from Pseudomonas fluorescens. That's exactly what they were to use in the strawberries out here, in which they put into the fruit trees in Oakland and already had put out without permission. The Pseudomonas, and this is the fluorescence, is the one that also would affect the immune system if you were weak. It's described as a soil-dwelling bacteria. In the New York Times, describes it as a bacteria. In California, they slipped it through as a pesticide, and I cited the difference, quoting Jeremy Rifkin last week. Monsanto scientists inserted a gene from another common bacteria, and the process involved 200 million to 400 million, and they said that they would spend this to test these organisms and eradicate, in this case, corn pests and so forth in the environment. Monsanto is planning to dip 2,700 corn seeds and agents into a quarter acre of an area, but they've been put on the carpet for some of the things that they did that were not supposed to be tested and were done in advance of any approval. Then, following that article the next day, there was a story, field test urge for pesticide Panel wants Monsanto to reduce some research, while the scientists say you can go ahead with the Pseudomonas fluorescens. So in Missouri, they will be the recipients of the first test because in California we stopped it. And again, they found out that they have been using this kind of experimentation already going back to 1984, and they kept it a secret. Another story in Wall Street Journal, panel says microbe test by Monsanto would be safe. If you have an $8 billion corporation, you certainly have enough scientists to back up what you're doing and to say it's safe, but it's the long-range effect of it. It isn't just that you put up a nuclear plant and you say, see, everybody's safe, or you use live bacteria in the field and you say, see, everybody is safe. It doesn't work that way. Just because they pronounce it safe, it will take years to know how it travels and moves, and once you let it out, as Mr. Rifkin said, you can't do anything about it. But I think it's interesting that Mr. Adams, who set up AGS with Roman Haas and Harvard and Princeton scientists and so forth, comes out of the office of Sullivan and Cromwell, and the new president of Monsanto, who's worked for them 17 years, was deputy director of the CIA. I am sure this goes back to the intent of Permindex, of the British American Canadian Corporation, and it is one more step in controlling people and masses of people through food, and it isn't so much improving agriculture. As I say, the summit in Japan was about the surplus of food, so what are they worried about if you have strawberries in the spring and not in January? There is a surplus. Meanwhile, my time is up here. I'll be back with you next week. Thanks again for all of your articles and material. If I don't answer your telephone calls right away, I will get to them, and the letters, and keep saving those articles. I appreciate them very much. This is Mae Brussell, and more horrendous stories on the horizon, I assure you, for next week.